Welcome to a special edition of the Vanntage Point. Based on comments that I've received from many of you, I'm embarking on a series of videos that will highlight the origin, development, and diffusion, or spreading out, of the Southern Appalachian or Southern Midlands dialect. For those of you new to the Vanntage Point, we have covered about 800 requested family names in previous episodes, and I can tell you that the origin of Southern Appalachian speech is reflected in what historical and genetic studies tell us about where many of us originated. It promises to be a thought-provoking, entertaining episode, so I hope you'll join me. Because residents of the Southern Appalachia and Upper South regions have an accent that's clearly different from the modern natives of northern Great Britain and Ulster, the 9 northern counties in the Emerald Isle, it's easy to dismiss similarities in their respective vocabularies and sentence structures. Admittedly, there are different words used to identify common objects. The change in words to identify common objects often happens because those items were invented after their common ancestors separated from each other. Here's a couple of examples of what I'm talking about. In Great Britain, a modern elevator is called a lift, and cigarettes are called fags. A simple comment about smoking on the streets of London, if overheard by an American, could be misunderstood. Nonetheless, the dialect of the upland south is remarkably like the speechways that were found in northern Great Britain and Ulster during the 16th or 17th and 18th centuries. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said 16th, 17th and 18th centuries. The Southern Appalachian accent was affected by other immigrants and natives who were already in the region. Pioneers picked up lots of words and no doubt sounds from the natives. Moccasin, kayak, chipmunk, and hurricane are words borrowed from native tongues. Other contributing immigrant groups included a smaller number of Germanic and French folk. Some of the sound that we now associate with Southern Appalachian and Southern English dialects is a blend of all those tongues. To fully appreciate America's Southern Midlands dialect, also called Scotch-Irish and Northumbrian dialects, it's important to reflect over the parent groups that contributed to its formation. I've been working on a surname project for the past year, and my findings on the origins of Appalachian surnames strongly supports the migration patterns depicted in recent historical and genetic studies. Although isolation from other European ethnic groups in America preserved much of the 17th century vocabulary, innovations, trade, and intermarriage with outsiders, including Cherokee, Shawnee, Creek, Chickasaw, and Choctaw people, affected the regional dialect's sound or accent, and its spreading out or diffusion. To see the assemblage of the region's linguistic parent groups, we're starting at the halfway point in our story. Why, you might ask, or why might you ask? Because it gives us the location of the dialect spoken before it started on its way to America. Its early formation was in Northumbria and the Scottish lowlands. Those areas are connected to the borderlands of Scotland and England. Because of the shifting border lines over the centuries, thieves or border reivers could easily skip detainment and prosecution by fleeing across the border. Naturally, there were many inter-family conflicts that popped up, so it's not surprising that we have those family feuds here in Appalachia. The Hatfield and McCoy dispute is among the most famous here in America, but it was by no means the only one. Border or Northumbrian turmoil began to die out in 1603 when Scotland's King James VI inherited his cousin Elizabeth I's throne to become England's King James I. Did you get all that? He was the earliest monarch with the authority on both sides of the lawless border to do something about the lawlessness. So he brought forced peace to the region. And about the same time, the early 1600s, he died in 1625, some of the border residents began to relocate to Ulster to take up farming on rented lands, which was also made possible by King James in his plantation initiative. To some people, James took on the prestige that later Americans would attach to Abe Lincoln. I contend that the regional popularity of the King James Bible is in part because of the Protestant community's arrival in Ulster and how much they respected him. Look at some of the words in the Mayflower Compact. Now those were Puritans who were definitely psychological and theological relatives of the Ulster Protestants, who were really basically Puritan Presbyterians, it shows great respect for James, who they called their dread sovereign. And dread back in 1620, not 1920, but 1620, was not a bad thing, it was a good thing. And you might find this interesting. King James I of 6 was also the first person to be called the monarch of Great Britain. The Scotch-Irish or Southern Midlands dialect is unique among English language forms. Now, how does English relate to other European languages? What do we mean when we say dialect and accent? Keep in mind that languages and culture in general become different from their parent groups through social isolation, technical innovation, and or social interaction with non-parent culture groups. It may be helpful to remember them as the three I's of cultural and social change: interaction, isolation, innovation. By searching for root words, linguists have discovered words shared with other tongues. In the case of common words, we assume that those languages share a common cultural ancestor. For example, in England and on the Isle of Man, one encounters the word fell, F-E-L-L. Sometimes F-E-L appears as a suffix as it does in Snaefell, the highest point on the Isle of Man. Now, fell, which means hill, was borrowed from Old Norse, the language of the Vikings. If we examine enough languages, which many scholars have done, it's possible to place them into distinct language families, which suggests that those languages are traceable to a common cultural group or ancestral people. This tells us that languages have linguistic parents, siblings, and even cousins. Of course, many non-related tongues exist in the world. Now, to put linguistic patterns into perspective, you might note that today there are 18 language families around the world that have at least 5 million speakers. There are dozens more smaller language families and specific tongues, I might add, that don't belong to a larger language family. Japanese, for example, doesn't really belong to any other language. It's its own language, maybe 150 million speakers. Anyway, for instance, have you ever heard of Romansh? It's a distinct language with fewer than 100,000 speakers. Romansh descended from Latin and is found mainly in Switzerland. Although it's a sister tongue to Italian and French and Spanish, it's sufficiently distinct to be considered its own language. All but 4 European languages belong to the Indo-European language family. Even American English and Mexican Spanish share membership of this family, so they're distant cousins. Language families can be divided into language branches, and Indo-European is no exception. In fact, there are 9 different language branches in the Indo-European family. They include Albanian, Armenian, Balto-Slavic, Celtic, Germanic, Greek, Indian, Iranian, and Romance. That's where Romansh belongs. Romansh belongs in the Romance languages. Now, language branches can be divided into groups. For example, the Celtic language branch has 2 groups: Dialect or Gaelic and Brythonic. The Germanic language branch is divided into North and West Germanic groups. Groups can be broken down into languages. In the case of the Celtic languages, there are Irish, Scots, and Manx Gaelic in the Dialect group, Breton, spoken in, or Britain I should say, spoken in France's Brittany region, Welsh and Cornish represent the languages in the Brythonic group. To the surprise of some, Southern Midlands English or Scotch-Irish is not a Celtic language per se, but no doubt Celtic values and notions have influenced its development. Now, let's move closer to Appalachian English. English, of course, is classified by linguists as a West Germanic language, just like we just saw, because it shares more words with the Frisian, German, and Dutch, or Netherlandish languages, than it does with Northern Germanic, which includes Danish, Faroese, Icelandic, Norwegian, and Swedish. One of the ways that Germanic languages differ from Romance or Latin-based languages is the order of adjectives and nouns in them. In English we say, "Well, that's a blue truck." In French it's said, "Maintenant, c'est une voiture bleue." Translated, that's a blue car. Anyway, English, despite its classification as a West Germanic language, has many cultural ancestors outside the group. This makes it difficult to place it into any category. The English language is like a cultural magnet. It borrows words from any other language that offers a new idea or object. For example, English has over 10,000 words from French. According to Robert McNeil, some scholars have jokingly said that English should be called a dialect of French. The original standard dialect of English was adopted from the West Saxon region of southern England. Now, the Saxons came from an area in northwestern Europe that lies on both sides of the Elbe River. Today, this area is in northern Germany. Within 100 miles of the Saxon hearth, one finds the Netherlands and the lands of the former Kingdom of Frisia. It's easy then to see why the standard dialect of English is considered West Germanic. Languages can be broken down into local varieties called dialects. And dialects are variations of a language that contain different vocabulary, grammar, and pronunciation than that of the parent language. Understanding can be made more difficult, however, when there is a difference in accent, which is the sound, and the dialect itself. The term accent refers to the way words sound, of course. Well, think of how Americans say aluminum versus how Brits say it. Aluminium. Aluminium. Well, folks, I hope you found this brief introduction interesting and will join me for episode 2. In it, we'll look at the cultural and linguistic contributions of the Romans, Germans, Vikings, and Normans. Until I see you again, may the good Lord bless you and keep you. Bye-bye.